Well, thanks, Ken,
Yeah.
for being here. Can you tell us just a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you teach, where you teach, and how you got into being a biblical scholar?
Yeah, I'm a professor of Old Testament biblical languages at a small little school called Toccoa Falls College in Northeast Georgia. It's connected with the Christian Missionary Alliance tradition. Been there. I'm in my 8th year there. Was at another school previously for 10 years. And I did grad school in Kentucky, moved to Tennessee. Now I'm in Georgia. So my next stop might be the Gulf of Mexico or whatever south. So
Yeah.
yeah, so I got into Old Testament. Yeah, it's kind of a weird route. I was converted at age 18. Thought I'd be a high school physics teacher. Wanted to be a coach. Went off and studied physics and math in college, and then uh, there was a pastor who'd been so influential in my conversion. I thought maybe I want to do what he does, and so I tried the seminary thing. Thought maybe I'd go for a few years, and then just through that. Dan Block is a name that may be well known. Right, he and I got to Southern Seminary at the same time and became real close with him. Became his research assistant, so that probably got me in. That looking back, you're looking back on how the Lord was working. I was a natural skeptic as a non-believer, and I'm not sure I ever shedded that completely. I like problems. I like troubling questions, and I have that a little bit of science background. So I think the Old Testament was the perfect place to kind of wrestle with my own faith and wrestle with God in these large questions.
So you focused on the notes on questions around science and the Bible, which comes up quite a bit. Are these questions that you've personally had, like as a non-believer, new believer, were you ever troubled by some of the scientific problems in the Bible?
I think early on, my Reformed Baptist tradition were focused on other things. And I remember going through my physics degree. No one ever asked me those questions. So I didn't know till seminary that there was a problem.
Okay.
So it was kind of weird, and I thought, oh, other people are talking about it. So I didn't come through all of that. So, but yeah, I had to wrestle with that, and I believe the Bible, and yet I look at the evidence over here, and so especially when you think about things like the age of the Earth, evolution, were kind of the main topics. But then, especially being a teacher, often the things I get interested in because my students are interested in them. And then whole global warming came on, and now COVID, and so you're trying to respond to those types of things. So I- while I've wrestled a little bit myself, it's been mainly trying to help my students and ultimately the church.
What would you say to somebody that says, the Christian faith seems great, the Bible seems really compelling, but I can't like bury my head in the sand and
Right.
and, and accept this very unscientifically or scientifically inaccurate book as my
Yeah.
authority. What would you say to somebody that's in that position?
Yeah. And part of me wants to do the Tim Keller approach and his reason for God, where he's like, don't get sidetracked on these others, just get to Jesus, right? And so make him the focus of, you know, Christianity will stand or fall on what you do with Jesus. But yeah, I mean, depending on the amount of time I have with a person, it'd be like, well, first of all, I understand why there's this issue in your mind, but the Christian faith has handled this and has worked with this, and the history of the church does not is not as flat as you're making it. And Christians have been wrestling with this. They come to different options on some of the things. Christianity as a theological enterprise does not bury. In fact, I think it's unchristian to not pay attention to what's going on in the world, what scientists come up with, and there's a robust tradition of Christians wrestling through these things and taking in all the data. And so let's have a further conversation and
Yeah.
talk about what that means and what that looks like. And maybe there's some presuppositions even in the question that aren't
Mm.
quite accurate.
I mean, there's a lot of assumptions, right?
Right.
That the Bible is scientifically inaccurate, or maybe would you say maybe a misunderstanding of how authoritative literature works? Like it can be authoritative and yet still have a human element. These biblical authors we believe were divinely inspired, but they also had an ancient cosmology.
Right.
They didn't have the scientific knowledge that we have, but I don't know, that doesn't necessarily mean it's like just inaccurate. It's like they're being who they were at that time too. Genesis 1 to 11 is kind of a hot place to go with science in
Of
the
course.
Bible. How would you, if you just what's your elevator pitch on how to read this literature? Because some people would say it's just pure myth. Some people it's just pure history, just like First Kings.
Right.
And those are kind of the polar ends of the spectrum. How would you summarize this literature?
Yeah, it really does come down to genre and expectations. Even the words myth and history, right? That means differently from the man on the street versus how it's handled in the scholarly world. And so part of it's defining terms. Part of it's understanding God's self-revelation. He condescended in his grace to speak to the people where they're at.
Mhm.
He wasn't there to change their minds on the perception of the world. And the Bible doesn't, what's interesting, the Bible doesn't, when we speak about the authority, whether it's we use inerrancy or something else, right? It's about the truth claims of the Bible. And it surprisingly does not claim certain things that we would put in a scientific bucket, right? It doesn't teach specific issues. It assumes, it allows the people to assume a certain perspective on the world without thinking about a globe, without thinking about this vast universe, without thinking that our brains are up here and they do the thinking. No, back in the world, is the heart,
Right.
and God wasn't going to change their physiology. And so part of it is saying, if you understand what God was doing, he was trying to speak to all people in all ages, but he chose a certain people at a certain time, and he allowed them to kind of live within their life. And the theological truths he was trying to teach were irrelevant to, infusing 21st century astrophysics into their brains.
That's good. Yeah.
So, yeah, I think it's the expectations. And then, as we know more about the way, of course, in my world, the ancient Near Eastern context, what they thought about the gods in the world, that's what it's interacting with. It's just, I just don't know if the Bible actually makes any scientific claims at all, other than there's a beginning, perhaps.
It's just kind of the assumed world they were living in a sense, but they're not like proactively going out of the way to say,
Right.
this is how the world is, and this is how it always will be. And
Yeah. So they're not, God didn't seem fit to try to teach those specific points. When they talk about the sun going up and sun going down, that's what they believed. And God was like, fine, that work for what I want to communicate. That's fine. If Jesus says the mustard seed's the smallest of all seeds, well, we don't need to get in a lesson about that there actually are smaller seeds. It was besides the point of what he was trying to talk about.
Okay, so one of the biggest, really heated disputes has to do with the age of the Earth, right?
Right.
I mean, I know people that if you don't believe in a young Earth, I mean, you don't even believe the Bible. You're probably not a Christian, And other people might go the opposite route. Can you help us navigate the questions around the age of the Earth? Like, how should we think through these questions in light of biblical authority?
Right. So, I mean, I'm a Bible guy. I'm a Bible nerd through and through. But as I understand the text and have been studying this and even looking at the history of church, I just don't think the Bible's asking that question at all. I don't think those early chapters of Genesis are, as you had said earlier, it's not straightforward history in the same way. I do think it's historical in the sense that it's talking about real people, real events, and a real past, but I don't think it's giving this kind of journalistic. So it really comes down to genre. What is God trying to communicate in the description of the world, whether it's Genesis 1, 2, or whatever? And so I am free to look to other sources of knowledge, like science, because to me, in the end, it's a theological question. What does a Christian do with general revelation? And science, of course, is part of general revelation. It doesn't mean you buy into everything that might be a scientific consensus, but we have to respect that whether they know it or not, scientists have been made in the image of God, and they are discovering truth, and then we have to put everything together. I ask myself this: if I thought the Bible was teaching a young Earth, and yet I find the evidence for an old Earth and universe overwhelming, what would I do? I don't know. I've never had to face that. Because the Bible doesn't seem to me trying to teach that point. So I totally understand. I've got, I live in a world where probably most people they wouldn't say that you can't believe in Jesus or the Bible, but though I know those people too, but they do come from a perspective that thinks the Bible teaches that. And so, pastorally, we try to, how can we find unity and have the good discussion? I don't care if we end up disagreeing on the conclusion. I do worry how we get there and how we treat fellow believers who might
Yeah.
disagree.
That's important on so many other issues.
Yeah, yeah.
So would you say like Genesis, the early chapters of Genesis would allow for both
Yeah, you
readings?
could certainly read it. I mean, I understand why somebody dots their I's and crosses their T's and land at a certain place. That's just not the journey I'm on. That's not how I connect the dots. I mean, I've got colleagues who are biblical scholars who disagree with me.
Yeah.
I'm happy to be at a place where we can happily disagree in front of the students, which I think is great for their education as well.
If somebody asks you, does evolution contradict the Bible? Or does the Bible contradict evolution? Like, how would you answer that question? Does the Bible are they incompatible, or is there a way to correlate these?
Yeah. Now you're really trying to get me in trouble. I think part of the being in the
We can edit
conservative
this out
world.
if we can.
No, it's okay. I've been in print, so that's fine. I think part of the trouble I've found myself in is that I'm happy to continue the discussion. That I'm not going to close the door and say absolutely not. Partly because I'm not convinced that the Bible is in the early chapters of Genesis is trying to give us a detailed play-by-play like a documentary. I often try to liken this to, like, on one end of the spectrum, we've got kind of a documentary style, and then you've got pure fantasy, fiction. There's a whole bunch of things in between. You can have movies that are inspired by history or based on
Right.
history. And so in some ways, trying to figure out where the early chapters of Genesis are, and I'm not even convinced I know exactly, but I suspect it's not the documentary style play-by-play.
Right.
Like if you get in a time machine and go back and hit record on your iPhone, I don't know what we would see. There is some freedom, I think, the authors are given to give an imaginative portrayal of real events and real people. So I think my personal conclusion on it is I do think there are some versions of evolution that could be compatible. I do find, I said earlier, I find the evidence for an old Earth overwhelming. I find the evidence for evolution compelling. It doesn't mean it's right, but it means I can't ignore it. I can't be the person who sticks their head in the sand. It may ultimately be wrong, and I acknowledge that, but I think there's enough models and enough discussion in the history of church that I don't want to shut it so fast. I mean, I personally am committed to historical Adam, and so that already puts me in a certain, on the more conservative end of those things, but I'm part of that discussion trying to figure out, and I don't feel like my day-to-day, thankfully, knock on wood, my teaching and interaction in the church depends on having that answer right away.
Yeah, the historical, I mean, for me, like Romans 5 and how the New Testament correlates Adam with Jesus, that's like, theologically, it seems like that's
and that's why again, I'm a Bible guy, and I think the Bible is affirming that. The genealogies that have Adam, I don't know of any ancient genealogy that puts fictitious people in them. So
okay, yeah. So one of the themes in the study Bible is that the Bible contributes not just to our personal and private faith, but also to our public faith. Is there one or two things you can think of that when it comes to science in the Bible that would be helpful for us to understand along those lines? That not just for the individual Bible reader,
right?
That's struggling with science, but to just the kind of the public proclamation of Christianity as a whole. What's a key takeaway from your research in the Bible and science?
I mean, in some ways, it's obvious, right, that we've had these debates that have been public, that have been both political and cultural, whether it's the evolution or COVID, right, global warming. This kind of interface between science and faith is naturally going to enter those kind of arenas. So it can't just be personal, even where it becomes part of, I remember political debates for president where these questions come up. I think I want to go back to something I said earlier, though. I think the biggest thing is that, and I think that maybe this is tangential to your question, but this question is ultimately a theological question. For me, it's as much as I love science, it's not a scientific question, but what does Christianity, historic Christianity, actually say about what we should be expecting from God's world? And I don't think it's ideally Christian when we just stick our head in a book, even though that book is very special and important. God has revealed himself in the world. And so that automatically makes it public and important and something that is going to, interact with believer and non-believer alike. And ultimately, back to where we started, because there are people who this is a hurdle for coming to Christ, I think it's really important that we show that this doesn't have to be a hurdle.
Yeah.
Right. Christianity needs to stand or fall with who Jesus is, not on some of these particulars.
I met several Christians that it was a hurdle, and
I
when they realized it didn't have to be,
Yeah.
it opened up the door for their conversion. So, Ken, thanks so much for the work you're doing, your ministry, and for contributing to this study Bible. I love that you're able to communicate not just on an academically accurate level, but also be able to communicate in a way that's very readable and really, really powerful. So I'm thankful for your contribution.
Thanks for allowing me to participate.